Good morning. I guess first, any questions or comments or things to say? Okay, guess not. Um, just wanted to take a look. Wanted you to take a look at this. This is all the ritual sites that we have at least published for the island of Oahu, and it's actually sort of interesting because if you look at it, you know don't bother looking at the individual sites, but you just look at all these red marks. What you're seeing is sort of the spread of ritual sites, not houses or agriculture or anything. And what's really sort of interesting about this is that it's a fairly even spread, except for this section of the island, the Eva Plain region. Now, as I think I mentioned last time, there's very little evidence there was dryland ag down here, but it wasn't a very productive area. The main value to this area was the fish ponds. Excuse me. The the population on Oahu is sort of split into three clusters. One, well, I suppose four. Two, three on the windward side, and then four on the Kona side here. And we're not really too sure why it played out the way it did, but Oahu, for much of its time in the Hawaiian, pre-European contact period, Oahu was very much like the Big Island. It was almost always splintered into different political systems. In other words, what you had was separate entities, separate states, or separate countries, if you want to think of it that way. Very rarely was Oahu under one high chief, which makes it really different than Maui, which was almost always under one high chief that also had Molokai, Lanai, and Koholalave. So it was very much like the Big Island. We're not really sure why. The population wasn't huge on Oahu. Kirch and Solins did a fascinating study of Honolulu over here in the 1980s, 1990s, 1980s, I think. Looking at sort of the pre-contact through monarchy period in terms of how the place changed, the Ahupua'a. And one of the things they found out that was really sort of striking, because it went against what people had thought, was that on Oahu, the population had not maxed out the land. On Oahu, or if it had, it was very inefficient, because when they looked at Honolulu, they found that when the Big Island chiefs, i.e. Kamehameha, came into and controlled Oahu, they actually were able to increase food production dramatically. So the standard story has always been for the Hawaiian Islands that what you had was population pressure, basically, drove everything. There appears that there might have been some of that, but what it appears to be even more significant is the fact that, at least on Oahu, is there wasn't really a highly centralized control which could basically demand efficiency. We're not sure what that's all about, but it says something sort of interesting about the island, that it very rarely was very coherent politically. And therefore, I think was one reason why the Maui chiefs very frequently would try to take over Oahu, because they could take over it piece by piece. They didn't have to fight the entire island. So Oahu is sort of a different place in that regard from, say, Maui or for example, Kauai to the west, which is almost always under one high chief. So in the Hawaiian, pre-contact, pre-European period, Oahu is almost always fragmented, usually with the windward chiefs sort of being the big players in the game. And basically your what we now call the North Shore group, and your Kona chiefs as being sort of secondary players. Waianae, for some reason, at least in the period just before the Big Island chiefs take over the entire island, was actually sometimes affiliated with Kauai. We don't know what that was about, because it doesn't make any sense. The channel between Oahu and Kauai is absolutely horrible. It's one of the most dangerous channels in the Pacific, actually. You can't get insurance, for example, if you take a boat back and forth. So why the chiefs here would actually be affiliated to the chiefs, especially on basically the windward side of Kauai, is sort of hard to fathom, but it very much was the case. And at least a couple of times, the chiefs, the chiefs that ran the Waianae side of the island, were actually chiefs sent over, were actually affiliated to the Kauai chiefs. So it's sort of one of the more complex paradoxes that we really can't make any sense about. Is the political relationships on Oahu were oftentimes pretty complicated and not what you would normally think of. It's certainly different than the other islands in many ways. So let's switch back over here. Now, a lot of this I went through last time. One thing I forgot to mention is you have to remember that in the early 19th century, both prior to the missionaries and also when the missionaries arrived here, but also in the rest of the Pacific in the early half of the 20th century, Europeans or Euro-Americans, whatever you want to call them, that are moving into the Pacific are generally, of course, coming by ship. They're always an incredibly small minority of the total population. And very frequently in the back of their minds, there's a, what do we do if this place blows up in our face? In the sense that the locals suddenly decide they don't want them around anymore. So one of the things you consistently find throughout the entire Pacific is when the Europeans come in and sort of set up shop, they invariably set up shop, one, away from the power center of the chiefs, whether it be Tahiti or wherever you're nearby, but not in the same place. Secondly, is they invariably set themselves up in a place that has a harbor. Now, there's two reasons for that. One is that stuff can come in the sense that there's stuff that they expect from Europe or the United States or whatever. It's easy to get it in, and so they're going to get involved in trade. But secondly, and equally important at the time, and you see this in the early European accounts here, is one of the reasons that the missionaries and your financial types move into Honolulu is because they figure if it really hits the fan, they can basically, hunker down in a spot and a ship will come and rescue them because they can get into the harbor. So, it's important to remember these folks right into the 1830s, 1840s. For one thing, there wasn't any rule of law in the Pacific. And secondly, you have to remember that in the Pacific, you don't have communications. Right into the 1850s, 1860s, if you write a letter, it takes 2 or 3 months to get back to the West Coast. And then it's going to take another 2 or 3 months to get back to the East Coast. So, if you're writing someone say, help, I need rescuing, whatever the problem is, you're going to be dead already or gone already by the time anyone finds out about it. You have to remember there was no communications until basically, telegraph, underwater telegraph systems at basically the turn of the 20th century. So what you had was a situation where you had to make sure that everything you needed in terms of emergencies was available to you right then. And you always had to have a contingency plan of suddenly there was some like a revolution or something happened and you were in the middle of it. This happened quite frequently. Samoa was famous for this. And so was a lot of Melanesia. So that's one of the reasons the Europeans, especially the Americans and Americans and Europeans set up shop in Honolulu Harbor, is they figure it's near the monarchy, but it's a little, it's one island away. And most importantly is they figured if worst came to worst, they could sort of barricade themselves in a couple of the warehouses or something next to the harbor, and they could get rescued. So that what we call a bolt hole. And this was actually one of the main reasons they went into Honolulu Harbor. This is why they stayed out of Lahaina. So it's important to remember that the Europeans didn't see themselves in control. They saw themselves in a situation where they might be trying to get stuff done, but you never were particularly sure from one week to the next or whatever, how long or how well it was going to play out. So you always had to have a contingency plan. What do I do if you want to think of it that way? And that's why Honolulu starts out that way. Now, because of its location and the fact that this group ends up dominant in terms of financial affairs, then very quickly everything sort of moves to it, and that turns into something else, which I also sort of went into last time. Let's see, I'm trying to think what I didn't or finish last time. I think I finished with that. Okay. When Honolulu becomes the sort of center of the American European, by the 1870s, 1880s, largely American sort of place, and Honolulu basically becomes, and oftentimes was called the Pacific version of San Francisco, and especially given our interrelationship with San Francisco, it sort of made sense. So if you want to, Honolulu was seen as like a smaller version of San Francisco. What that meant if you were going to come to visit the Hawaiian Islands, Honolulu was where you would go. One is that's where all the ships stopped anyways. But secondly was that Honolulu was the place that if you were from someplace else, Honolulu was the most cosmopolitan of the Hawaiian Islands. In the late monarchy period, it's the most organized of the Hawaiian Islands. And so what happens is Honolulu very quickly, as things like both business, but later, of course, tourism pick up, Honolulu becomes the center of tourism simply because it's the island that tourists feel most comfortable with. And so initially they're in Honolulu town, which basically was from downtown to what's now Thomas Square, which is where the town ended. Now, the other thing that picks up pretty quickly is this idea of Waikiki, or more accurately, Vaititi. And that's really sort of a complex situation that has to do with the chiefs really trying to be westernized. From the 1820s, 1830s on, when the monarchies really, sort of stabilized and things are, sort of organized, the chiefs very quickly got into a very competitive frame of mind, as I think I mentioned before, where what they wanted to do is they wanted to emulate what they considered European upper class. And if you would, and by definition, that meant European royalty. And one of the things the Europeans did, of course, is if you had money, is you had multiple homes, and you had multiple homes in nice locations. So you had the home, your main residence, which would oftentimes be in a city, but then you'd have other homes, maybe where they did skiing or, I don't know, whatever the hell Europeans did. And so when the Hawaiian chiefs, the very wealthy, powerful chiefs in the mid-monarchy period, are trying to emulate these Europeans, one, they set up their grand residences. So that's the palaces of the king, for example, that are laid out. And then, for example, Kamehameha III had another palace back in Nuuanu, back up in the valley, which was sort of his, getaway residence, which was apparently quite large and very spectacular. Other chiefs decided to basically put their second residences, or if you would, their weekend party residences or relaxation residences, down the area of Waikiki. And the reason was very simple. One is that had an excellent beach for canoes, because you have to remember canoeing, to a lesser extent surfing, were a big deal. Also, before the surf break got all screwed up when they built the Ala Canal, it had a break that basically went completely across the harbor, or basically what is Vaititi. So you could basically surf. It wasn't particularly large surf, but you could surf for, apparently 10 or 15 minutes on a single wave as it was coming in slowly. So for the chiefs who saw surfing as one of their recreational pursuits, and it was limited pretty much to chiefs into the 1830s, but even more so canoes, Vaititi became the place to play. And so what they built is they built what oftentimes in other places would be called vacation homes in Vaititi. And then, of course, because the chiefs are all competitive with each other, is that they would build bigger vacation homes than their neighbors had. And so what you got into is sort of like, keeping up with the neighbors type thing, but doing better than the neighbors, became a big way that the chiefs would display their power and their wealth. And they did that through their weekend residences in Waikiki. Now you have to remember the distances aren't very big, even if you're traveling by carriage or horse. It's only going to take I don't know, I would guess maybe an hour or two to get from Nuuanu, where the big homes were their actual residences, to Waikiki. And that's why you get Kalakaua Avenue. That was the main transit route out there. So it wasn't a distance, but it was a large enough distance that you had two places that you could show off. And very quickly, Waikiki becomes the place where the chiefs play. And Waikiki becomes the place where the chiefs have these beautiful, part-time residents, very much like you see today with the part-time vacation homes in places like Kula. And so that becomes key, because when tourism starts up, the tourist population, isn't interested in being the center of a small version of San Francisco that's just like home. So what happens is very quickly the tourists, who tend to be, of course, wealthy, and the chiefs want to PR them, end up very frequently in the chiefs' residences down in Waikiki. Now the plantation boys, the Kamaaina, build their homes with the chiefs down in Waikiki, and so it's absolutely huge residences. I think it's the Cook House, and there's also the Dole House and stuff in Waikiki near where the natatorium is now. These absolutely enormous, 3 and 4 story, 15 bedroom, they look like small hotels. These absolutely huge, very, very fancy homes. Because what happens by the 60s, 70s, and 1880s is a lot of the money's now shifted from the chiefs, who are now pretty much land rich and cash poor, to the plantation owners, which are, land rich and cash rich. And so what happens is Waikiki sort of subtly moves away from the chiefs being the area, or I should say Waikiki moves away from being the chiefs' weekend recreation spot to being the wealthy plantation owners' recreation spot. But what it keeps in all of that is it keeps the idea that if you want to be somewhere that's fancy and has things to do and is devoted to pleasure, versus downtown, which is devoted to work, then that's Waikiki. And that, as we see, that morphs into the Waikiki we have today, is basically the modern, 4th generation or whatever spin on that whole thing. Now, by the 1880s, 1890s, of course, as I think I mentioned before, you also have the military moving in, i.e. the US military moving in, and eventually setting up shop in Pearl Locks, and then setting up ancillary installations around the island, especially on the Kona side, to protect the naval infrastructure at what becomes Pearl Harbor. Key thing to remember with all this is that you end up with the same irrigation systems you do on the other islands. Castle and Cook puts in a complex irrigation system, tapping the water here and runs it to this area here. So you have large sugar plantations, pineapple plantations, of course, doles up here, basically running from here all the way over to here. You also have ranches, especially in the Waianae area, but also up here. But the thing is that because you've got a large, sort of financial and business and government population base down here, the ranches and the plantations on the island of Oahu never gained dominance. So unlike Maui or the Big Island, or especially Kauai or someplace like that, you never see plantation owners, for example, dictating how the place is going to operate on Oahu. They're always part of the mix, but it's a much more complex and dynamic system going on here between the monarchy power elite, which means the chiefs, on your financial sort of, Kama'aina power elite, which includes the plantations, but also includes bankers and whatever. And so what happens is, versus the other islands where you'd see, either the plantations, think of Alexander and Baldwin, for example, on Maui, or the ranches like Parker and the Big Island, where they become basically the dog that runs the place. On Oahu, it's always a much more complicated, sort of diverse thing, which is sort of weird because in some ways it actually reflects the pre-contact period, where Oahu was always a set of split polities. So Oahu's always been a more diverse place in terms of economic and political control. And that meant that, for among other things, there's a lot less coherency to it. There's not the same sort of structured situation. But it also means that when the military comes in, they become yet another player in all this. And so by the 1930s, the military controls this, the military controls over here, the military controls this whole center section up here. So even prior to World War II, the military was one of the larger landowners on the island of Oahu. And in terms of money, they were already probably significantly larger than the plantations and the ranches here on Oahu. Now, that's not true in the other islands. Prior to World War II, the military, for all intents and purposes, had no facilities in the other islands. So Oahu, right from the late 1880s on, is following a different path and going different ways than the other islands are. And this is always important to keep in mind. So when you're talking about, environmental or social or political issues on Oahu, you can't extrapolate those to the other islands because there's very rarely a lot of close, sort of coherency with them. So when you're looking at Oahu, the military becomes a big player. You have the stereotype of power elites, in other words, money. So if you want, or you're involved in money, you come to Oahu. And if you're going to do anything related to the recreation part, you're going to come to Oahu, which helps to explain Waikiki, which otherwise is a pretty unattractive spot. Prior to the development of the Alawai Canal, you had streams running in here. Waikiki itself was actually a mudflat. So it wasn't a particularly attractive location for the European stereotype of the Pacific Island paradise. For the chiefs, it was a very useful place because those mudflats are great for running canoes ashore and stuff like that. For what the chiefs wanted to do, Waikiki was perfect. For the plantation elites, they probably weren't as interested in most of Waikiki. What they were actually really interested in is this part over here, which is now Kapiolani Park, because that was one of the main things that really drove the development of Waikiki. It was one is the chiefs living here in what's now the area of Waikiki, especially along what's now Kuhio Avenue. But secondly is the fact that by the 1850s, 1860s, Hawaiians were addicted to horses. There's all sorts of accounts. Anyone that came to the island of Oahu would constantly complain if you were walking downtown. Men and women would be screaming around at whatever the horse's version of 900 miles an hour, zooming up and down the streets. The women and the whole sort of pareo type, outfits that they would wear with, cloth flying behind them. Everyone in hats, just zooming around all over the place. So sort of like a bunch of 19-year-olds with Acuras today on the freeway would be Hawaiians, part Hawaiians, and everyone else here racing around on horses and, as fast as they get the boogers to go. Hawaii was famous for that. We actually had strangely enough, you look in the 19th century newspapers, almost invariably there's people having accidents on horses, either falling off of horses or running into other people, which if you think about it, that's like running into people with a moped. It's really pretty hard to visualize someone running into someone on a horse, but it says how people were, basically handling these things. So in this context, this becomes key because they build a horse race track. And that's actually what Kapiolani Park is. Kapiolani Park was the horse race. And everyone and his brother had to go down there. It was the 19th century equivalent of UH football games at Aloha Stadium. Everyone and his brother went down there every weekend to bet on the horses or race their horses or whatever. And so this became the other center for, fun times, just like the Chiefs were doing fun times here. This section over here at Kapiolani Park became the fun times for everyone else, i.e. the common population would go down there. The first trolley on the island of Oahu was from downtown to Waikiki, not for surfing or the beach, but horse racing. So this was the center of everything that went on. Very quickly, they built a little zoo over here. They also had a guy raising ostriches. We had a huge problem right into the 1920s of wild ostriches running around Diamond Head. They're all gone now, which is sort of a drag because those things are really weird. But we used to have our ostriches all over the place here in the lower part of Kaimo Key. But the big thing was the horse race track. And you have to remember at that point in time, this was all basically marsh and leftover fish ponds and wet fields in this section here. So Waikiki was sort of an interesting spot because it bears no resemblance to what it is now. But it was already the place that people thought you go there to have a good time. And you go there and it was considered to be totally different than downtown, which was, business and money. So even Honolulu starts to split apart into different pieces. And what that also means is everything in between becomes places people live. So if you went to your residential area, it becomes everything that isn't business central or the sort of recreation central. Oops, hang on a second. Now, one of the side effects of all this is that with the lack of dominance, you don't end up with the persistent sort of version of plantation villages that you get on the other islands. You end up with a much more complicated scenario because in many cases, Honolulu is where anyone who breaks their contract on the plantations. Honolulu is the easiest place to find work. You're going to disappear into town, so the guys that arrest people that are broken contracts can't find you. So very quickly what happens is Honolulu becomes the place that you go if you don't want to work on a plantation anymore. And from there, you sort of spread out to wherever it is you're eventually going to end up. And so what happens is very quickly Honolulu ends up with, among other things, a number of what we call ethnic enclaves. So the most famous, of course, would be Chinatown. And when you're actually looking at Chinatown, of course, what you're actually looking at is the whole sort of infrastructure that basically was working down here in the business central district, needed cheap labor. They wanted people around and they wanted them to be segregated. And so what you get is the population over here. The Hawaiian population is already living in New Wano. So the Chinese population, since they're the other first group of migrants, they and the Portuguese move into here. So the Portuguese enclave was basically the Mackay slopes of Punchbowl. The Chinese basically move in over here. In part it's segregation, but you have to remember also in the same way the Portuguese moved over here, no one made the Portuguese live next to each other. But if you're living in a strange country with people that speak a different language, you want to be around people who speak your language, who you hang around with, they celebrate the same things you do. So to a certain extent, ethnic enclaves here were as much driven by people's desire to be around things that were comfortable and normal than someone, say the Anglo elites down here saying, well, you guys are all Portuguese, we want you to live out here. That's very true of Chinatown. Chinatown wasn't intentionally made. Chinatown was basically put up. It was near downtown. The Chinese worked downtown in many, many cases. Their business were close to downtown. So the laundries, the tailors, all the rest of that stuff, because that was their business clientele. So they set up shop in this area over here, and that became Chinatown. Once it becomes established as Chinatown, then these social stereotypes start to kick in, and Chinatown becomes a dangerous place. It becomes a creepy place. It becomes a place that you want to be careful of. And that becomes its stereotype. Now, it's also a residential area, but that's sort of becomes secondary to the stereotype. Punchbowl never gets that, though a large part of the population in Punchbowl is actually still of Portuguese descent. The Japanese, of course, are coming in about 5 or 10 years later. By then, this is all pretty sewn up. This area's all been pretty much bought into. And so the Japanese move in over here. The Japanese move into what becomes called Little Tokyo. That's now Moili and McCully. And in fact, McKinley High School was called Tokyo High. So what you get is this becomes the area where your second wave of immigrants move in. The Koreans and Okinawans and other groups that follow them have to find their way around the margins of these areas. So what you find is each group that comes in tends to almost be like a layered onion. They want to be close to downtown because in some way, shape, or form, that's where the job and the money are. So if you lived here, if you lived in Moili and McCully, you could walk to downtown. It took about 40 minutes. So you could stay stay in a relatively cheap here, but you can still get to work. When the tram system starts up now, you can take the tram on King and Baratania and get into work. Same with the Chinese. So the groups that come in later and later get pushed out further and further. Now, what also happens then as the groups that live in areas like Moili or Chinatown, or even say the Portuguese up here, the problem with those areas is once they've been established, the houses are fairly small, they start to get more expensive. And so what you get is then your populations start to move out into areas like Kaimuki. So they, for example, move out from here because that's getting too expensive. You move into areas like Kaimuki, Palolo, because you can actually buy a bigger house for cheaper. So the migration into our area here, and you can see it's just the very congested living patterns in this part of the island, are a result of families trying to have ownership of property versus renting and moving out to these new neighborhoods. Now what that means is because these are second migrations in the sense that they already live somewhere here. So they're moving from somewhere closer to town to a little bit further from town, but someplace that they basically can afford a place. Same reason you see people living in Mililani or Kapolei now. So this isn't folks coming to the Hawaiian Islands as fresh off your boats. This is folks oftentimes maybe first or second generation that are basically looking to buy a piece of property and actually have a place that's more their own than they can afford closer to town. And that's the subdivisions that include us. And that's why these look very different than if you think about it than the area here. This is a much more urbanized, much more congested, and a large part of the population here was on rentals, and still are. So a lot of the population here doesn't own the place they live in. So these folks, if they get enough money together, want to have a place, and so they move further out. So again, you get this layering effect, which is very, very typical of Oahu, but it's different than most of the rest of the islands. It's different than most other places in the world, actually. In most other places, if you're in an ethnic ghetto, you stay there. Here you move out, and you move into what becomes the suburbs. That's also on the other side that, of course, would be Kalihi too, which is generally Hawaiians that couldn't afford to live in Nuuanu, move into Kalihi. So in both directions, you get these suburbs basically building up. Now, one of the side effects of that is because they're all coming from Asian and Pacific Island backgrounds, particularly Asian, where you don't have the idea of segregation of business and home. So your business is generally downstairs and your home's upstairs, which is still what you see in all of Asia. What you get is a development of places like Kalihi, and then also, of course, Kaka'ako, which are a combination of residential and business. So a lot of what's called light industry on the island of Oahu is, again, as part of this ring function of populations basically setting up a little, body repair shop or something like you still see in Kaka'ako. And then they would live over on the top of it or live in a small house next to it. You can still see this mixed pattern here. Because you've looked at a lot of these places there are a lot of what were residences in Kaka'ako, and that's part of this 20th century movement to basically, if you have your business there, you can build your home there and your family can have a place to live and you can, get successful and get ahead. So again, what you find is this very complex mix of business and residence, which is certainly true in Lower Kalihi even today. So this becomes, notice how the area is sort of on one hand parts segregate. Waikiki segregates, downtown stays the center of industry and politics, and the rest of the island becomes this very complex mix of sort of layers of movement out. And as they move out, what happens is you lose the ethnic identity in the sense that it becomes a more diverse place. Kaka'ako doesn't have any tradition of being particularly Chinese or anything. A large part of the population was part Hawaiian. because of the work down here in the lower part of Kakaako. But it wasn't uniquely a Hawaiian community or Portuguese or whatever. Same with Kalihi or the other communities. They become very, very diverse. And this is a key thing to remember because you find this more than you do on the other islands. On the other islands, there's diversity. But on Oahu, you know, if you're living in some place like this and you've got your neighbors nearby, and we'll say that you're, you know, Okinawan and your neighbor here is Japanese and the other one over here is Chinese and this guy here is Korean or whatever, and there's a Portuguese guy across the street. You have to remember the history of the Hawaiian Islands isn't that people like each other. The history of the Hawaiian Islands is that people accommodate each other in the sense that you don't have to like your neighbors, but you have to put up with your neighbors because they ain't going anywhere and you ain't going anywhere. So because you don't have a history of migrating like you do on the US mainland where people move every 3 to 5 years, here in Hawaii, if you have a place you're going to stay in it, that means your neighbors are going to be there perpetually too. So what you find is the population very early, especially on Oahu, gets used to the idea that they live in a very complex multi-ethnic community, and it's a community where you have to be able to put up with people doing stuff that's different than your own. So on one hand, people tend to be pretty private in terms of their own house, but then they also tend to see this larger community as something they're a part of, even though people in the community are not like them. This is very, very different than what you find in almost anywhere else in the world, not just the US mainland, but in Europe or any place else. And every place else, you'd pretty much find a block of one group and a block of, say, Portuguese and a block or two of Chinese. And these guys down here would all be Japanese. You're going to find, you know, segregation even at, say, the block level. Here in Hawaii, it doesn't happen, especially on Oahu, because as people come into money, they need to buy a place, they want to have a house, they want to have maybe a business, and they're going to buy whatever's available. So you put up and you tolerate people who are different. You don't have to like them, but you learn how to tolerate them, and you realize pretty quickly that you can. And of course, as the kids grow up and they're going to school somewhere around there, then they're going to have even more of that, you know, sort of not necessarily liking each other, but the idea of sort of, you know, being able to put up or tolerate people that do stuff that's different than you. What you have to remember for most people, even in the United, especially in the United States, is not a common heritage. Common heritage in the United States is the way we do it is right, and you better suck up and, you know, become that. So this idea of there's some sort of a normative pattern is not really typical. Oahu's probably the best example of that in terms of the diversity of the place. Several things become really, really central. And this, of course, is all due to the fact that by the time that we become a territory, say 1900, all the power, all the money, all the decision-making is happening here in Honolulu. Every place else is marginal. And to be honest, if you're the plantation owners on the other islands, you want it that way. Or if you're the ranch owners on the big islands, you don't want the Americanized government in Honolulu to get in your way because they're going to interfere and cause trouble. So it's sort of the big, you know, anti-big government thing. So the other islands aren't particularly interested in what Oahu does, just as long as Oahu keeps them on Oahu, pretty much, which means they don't access the resources. So when you look at infrastructure development, it's here way earlier than the other islands. In fact, Honolulu is oftentimes actually ahead of the curve. Honolulu and San Francisco are very much ahead of other areas, even on the West Coast. We have a public sewage system here by the 1880s. You can still go down Baratania Street, right across from, for example, the Academy of Arts, Thomas Square there. If you go down, we actually did a survey down there years ago. Underneath Baratania Street is this absolutely beautiful, almost 20-foot high bricked arch that's actually the sewage system that was built in, I believe, 1882. Still functional, beautifully done brickwork, probably by Portuguese bricklayers, I would guess, that's still there. So we have infrastructure very early, which if you think about it, can necessarily, as we'll see later, can be a problem. But what you also then get is because you've got this population sort of spreading out in an onion pattern off the business center of downtown, and that business center needs those people because that people are its workforce. They're the secretaries, the people that run the little shops, the other stuff that make downtown functional. So you want them to get into work on time in the morning. So what you get very early, again, is public transportation here. Public transportation is sort of cool. Let's see if I can fish up a picture of this. I'm sorry, I should have done this before. Let's see. You oftentimes think of transportation, especially now since there's this whole discussion of things like the rail system. This is actually the system we had. It's very, very similar to us. Horse-drawn carriages, basically, that ran on rails, so they were more, energy efficient in the sense there's less friction. That's how people got around. This was what King Street and Beretania are. King Street and Beretania were the rail system, especially King Street, which is why it was called King Street, after the king. So King Street was the initial rail track that ran from downtown. Initially only went to basically, Moilili, St. McKinley High School, then very quickly extended, and eventually it ended up going to the top of Cocoa Head. So it came up King Street. In fact, if you think about it, still you drive to King Street, that turns into sort of, whatever it turns into, and then it becomes Waialae Avenue. That's all based on the rail system, because that was the first paved street in the Hawaiian Islands. So this becomes our not too rapid transit system of the 1870s, 1880s, was the horse-drawn trolleys. Then these become mechanized in the sense that you put a motor in the front of these, and that becomes your horse-drawn, your gas-driven trolleys. But at the top of Cocoa Head, if you go up to Cocoa Head and you stop there at the Kaimoki at the Cocoa Head Avenue thing there, that actually was a big turnaround, similar to what you see in San Francisco with the cable cars still. And what you would do is that's where this would end. You'd turn that around, turn the horse around on a big pivot, and then the thing would go running back down to, back to downtown. That's why Kaimoki and Palolo get built. Kaimoki and Palolo are the first subdivisions in the Hawaiian Islands because the transit system got out here. So all of a sudden, if it's 1880, 1890, it's too far to walk from Kaimoki to downtown. It would take you like 2 hours. So you can't get to and from work if you're walking. If on the other hand, you're taking this and it's going, 3 miles an hour, then you can get into work in basically an hour. So this basically opened up this side of the island. It's sort of interest that they didn't have a trolley going the other direction, Kalihi side, because the plantations were down there in Pearl City IS. They didn't bother, which is one reason why that side didn't develop the same way as this side. So if you live in Kaimoki or Palolo now, or you take the bus, what you're basically looking at is a 21st century version of the horse trolley that basically defined this part of the island. And if you visualize it, you can actually sort of see it, because what that means is Waialae Avenue was the place the trolley was. And so the further you got from Waialae Avenue, the further you had to walk to get to Waialae Avenue to catch the trolley to get into work. So if you actually look at the older homes, the more expensive older homes are within a block or two of Waialae, and the houses get smaller and cheaper further away, because the further away you got, the sweatier you got, and the longer it took. So it was less attractive. So we have the first transit system. I mean, you can't call it rapid, but it was one of the first transit systems. In fact, it was the first one in the Hawaiian Islands, and I believe outside of San Francisco, maybe Seattle, it was like the second or third in even like the whole west coast of the United States. So Hawaii is not on the low end of the curve. In the 19th, early 20th century, we were very much in the sort of cutting edge of new sort of urban design and stuff like that was happening here at the same time it was happening in your very sort of westward, forward-thinking areas like San Francisco. And in many cases, I believe like the first trolley system, I think it was the Oahu trolley. I think they were partially funded by the one in San Francisco. So you have to remember that financially, economically, even socially, especially Oahu is very, very closely tied to San Francisco, and the places look a lot alike, and that's not accidental. That was sort of part of the way that we developed. And that's why Oahu and especially Honolulu have a very different look than even the other side of this island, because of the way the transit system builds up here. Now, one of the side effects of this, let's see, oh, sorry, I shouldn't have switched back here. Let's switch back. Okay. If we go, since we're a perfect example, is out here. Now, if you look at this, this is why you see here. So here's your rail system, or I should say, here's your trolleys coming down here, going down Waialae Avenue. So if you can, the nice houses are going to be here. The not quite as nice houses are going to be here. Because you have to remember the freeway and other stuff exists. And that's also why it's laid out in a grid. It's not all Kapakai like the area further in, because this area is laid out. Developers would buy chunks of property out here, build homes on spec. In other words, they'd build the homes and then sell them. And they would sell them to the folks that really wanted to own something, and now they could take the trolley into work. So Waila Avenue basically builds this whole part of the island, and it goes up to here and then it turns around. So in that context then, what you're not going to see is this. So it's 1920s, or I should say it's 1900. Okay. So the trolley's running this way. There's City Mill right there. So the trolley's running here. Now, why isn't anyone going to live up here? And you have to remember, this is a period where the only way you get around is either by foot or by horse, or horse and wagon. What's the problem with here? And like most semesters, this semester we're not doing a walk around campus, which I usually do since there's no way to do that. Why does everyone moan and groan when I want to show them the caves over here on the side of campus on St. Louis Heights? What do they have to do after we look at these? They got to get back to class. Why are people not happy with this? Visualize yourself with a horse and a wagon. What's the problem with St. Louis Heights? Yeah, it's uphill. Yeah. If you think about it, if you've got a large wagon and a horse in front of it, and you try to go down a hill, what's going to happen really fast? You got problems. You know, it's a 1 horsepower machine, but the horse is not in the machine. The horse is in front of the machine. Yeah, the horses get tired going uphill. They can't do it. Given the weight of wagons, if you have a wagon with horses and you try to bring it up this hill, you could probably only carry about 250, maybe 300 pounds in the wagon, which means, you know, if you're a pretty good sized guy and you picked up groceries somewhere at Foodland, you can't get them up the hill. The horse can't do it. The horse is going to wheeze out and keel over on you right about here. And if you're going down the hill, it gets really exciting because the wagon's pushing the horse. So, you know, this don't work. Now, one of the side effects, what this meant is that in basically into the, you know, early 20th century, is no one lived on the hills. All the wealthy people live in New Wanu, simply because that's very easy access to, you know, what everyone wanted, which was, you know, downtown. So the wealthy folks live up here, which is still the largest state you see when you go up here, and even now, they live up in this area. And that's because that was easy access. You could ride a horse or have your driver take you in your carriage, and you could be to work, you know, in 15 or 20 minutes for no effort whatsoever, and it was pretty much flat. There was not anyone living in the hills. The only reason the Portuguese lived in the hills up here on this slope is because it was so close you could walk. One of the side effects is if you look at the really old houses here, you find that they don't have garages because you couldn't keep horse and carriage because why? You couldn't do it. So this was foot only basically. So when you look at images of, even early 20th century, you look at pictures of the island of Oahu, especially this part of Honolulu, what you realize is very striking is there's no one on a hill. Everyone's on the flats. So what changes that is all of a sudden you start to get basically what you call the Model T, or I think it's the Model T Ford. What you start to get it by 1915, 1920, is all of a sudden people now have access to a car. Now, as people start to get access to a car, that means that now they can get around in a much easier fashion. Now they can basically drive. If you've got cars, that means you've got trucks, you've got pickups, you've got all the rest of that. And so all of a sudden what happens is you get a massive change, whereas it had been before where the wealthy people are going to live here along Wildlife, for example, because it's near to the tram system. As people start to get private transportation, one, they're not that interested in the tram. It's slower. So they're going to, and if they have their own car, they can do whatever they want to. Secondly, what they're going to do is they're going to start to build homes up on these ridges because now you can drive up St. Louis Heights. Even more importantly, the contractor can take stuff up there so the contractor can build you a home in St. Louis Heights or any other heights. Now, this has an enormous impact here on the island of Oahu, especially the Honolulu side, because all of a sudden what happens is because it's almost invariably, at least in most cases, cooler on the ridges, you got a view, etc., is that the folks that had the wealthier properties down here sell them and they move on to the ridges. And this is still what you see today, with the exception of maybe Kahala, Hawaii Lower Ridge, all these places that you see where the very wealthy folks live are on the ridges. The most famous of these would actually be over here. Where your wealthy folks live in Nuuanu in this part of Makiki, leave, they just absolutely disappear. And what they do is they move back in this area up here, which still has stunningly expensive homes. A lot of the old plantation families, the Wilcoxes have 2 homes up here. The Cooks have, I believe, 4 homes up here. So a lot of your really moneyed power group that used to live in Nuuanu, once the car shows up, they leave Nuuanu. Now the homes are still in Nuuanu. Those are the embassies that you see. But the families themselves moves up on the ridges. It gives them more privacy, more isolation. And of course, with a car, what the hell difference does it make? You just drive, or you have your chauffeur drive you. So what happens is money and power moves up onto the ridges, moves up into up on the slopes of the valleys. Now, in the case of here, for us, that has consequences because when the Marianists move in down here, when the Marianists move in down here, they actually owned all of St. Louis Heights. They bought this, but I have no idea what they were planning to do with it at the time. It's the early 20s. So I think by then cars were already becoming a big way. I don't know why they then turn around and sell it, but they do. So the only thing they end up keeping is a section here. But this originally was all Marianist property, or I should say it was Marianist property in the early 20th century. And ironically, they moved the campus out here from where it had been, which is on College Walk, which is in Chinatown, because they wanted the students in the boarding school, which was St. Louis School. They thought there was too much distraction in Chinatown because it was the center of the action. So they figured if they dumped them out here in the middle of nowhere, because there was nothing here, then basically the kids would have a better chance to not get distracted and they'd be better students. So the campus is put here with the idea of getting it out of town. And of course, the irony is within 10 years, town follows it right out. And within 20 years, it starts to get built up and boom, town's here. It's a suburb, which is what we see now still today. So there's 2 changes that take place here, and we're a good example of that. One is the tram system or public transportation moves you here. Second is when the car comes up and gives individuals autonomy in terms of where they want to go, is then what you get is the movement onto the ridges. And to a certain extent, the movement out of the valleys. So what you find, and again, Palolo is a perfect case in point, the cost of homes on the ridges is much higher than the cost of homes in Palolo Valley, even though they might have exactly the same square meters in terms of the actual floor area. And that's standard here, especially on the island of Oahu. Now, on the other islands, because they don't have the same growth patterns, you don't see the same relationship of place. What you usually find is the entire town is more expensive or less expensive. But here in Oahu, what you find is elevation becomes a key thing once the automobile comes into play. Now, among other things, this means that the bus system here becomes an absolute nightmare because you got to figure out how you're going to do this. This is why you see such a complex bus system here in terms of, bus this and bus that. Because you've got this population going in very complex patterns. And of course, also what you get is the populations in the ridges tend to have more money. So, how much public transportation are they going to use, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the complexities you get into is the relationship of what you might call valley populations like these and ridge populations like these and the relative worth of them. And of course, one of the ancillary side effects is what you get in the case, especially of Pololo, is that because the ridges now become so valuable, is you build on them even when you shouldn't. So this is why we're always having problems, one, of homes being destabilized on the ridges and homes being shoved up the sides of the ridges as far as possible. And then, of course, having the rocks fall down on them, or in the case of Waiomau, actually have the homes slide down. So if you look at this, you can really see the difference. The homes down here wouldn't be worth anything compared to the homes up here. And you can see this, if nothing else, just in the size of the homes. But you wouldn't have seen, this was entirely empty space until the 20s and 30s, and even later than that when the automobile finally starts up. So we're very much sort of two patterns. Folks that live in the low areas, the flats, which used to be the high-end areas, and folks that lived that moved into the ridges, which were the folks out of here. This is one of the dramatic discrepancies you see here, especially in Honolulu, is how much more the ridges are worth than the valleys, which is again reflective of transportation changes and also people's individual mobility. Okay. I guess we'll stop there. We got to the car. The car is really key because everything we see since then has been in some way, shape, or form related to the car. So we'll finish up with the freeway and the rail and the whole idea of public transportation and private mobility next time, since that's one of the huge issues here on Oahu, has been for ages, and it's continuing to get worse. I should point out, by 1910, people were already complaining of traffic jams downtown, and there were only a couple hundred cars at the time. So, shed a tear for them. Okay, I guess with that, are there any questions? Carolyn's good.